This is the CineSnob podcast.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to bonus episode number 18 of the CineSnob podcast. My name is Cody Villafana. There's no regular CineSnob podcast show this week because I am at Sundance. This is day, I think, 4 of the festival, and it's been really great so far. The at-home experience has been awesome, and I look forward to coming back on the show and talking a little bit about some of the best stuff that I saw. But the reason why we're recording this intro today is to introduce an interview that I did a few days ago with one of my personal favorite film directors, Edgar Wright. So it's no secret I've been a big fan of Edgar Wright for a long time. Obviously, the Cornetto trilogy is incredible, but I also really love Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and I think he's just a brilliant, brilliant director. And he is at Sundance this year with his first ever documentary film. And it's a documentary about the band Sparks. I don't know if anyone out there has ever heard of Sparks. They are a sort of like a pop rock band that is one of those bands that never quite got their due in America, but were kind of big in the UK and overseas, and are kind of a bit of an enigma band, a very influential band, and they've been around for 50 years. And Edgar Wright made a documentary about the band and their story and their persistence and a lot of good stuff, which is just premiered at Sundance yesterday as of this recording. So I had the chance to sit down over Zoom with Edgar and talk about the documentary, the band Sparks, what drove him to make the film, and a bunch of other stuff. And there's a mention at the end of the interview of Edgar has this Sparks for Beginners Spotify playlist, which I highly recommend. I actually just got into Sparks myself over the past couple weeks preparing for the interview, and I really love the band. I recommend Kimono My House is a great album, but I just really kind of relish the opportunity to speak to Edgar, and especially surrounding my first ever Sundance Film Festival. It's been a really great experience. So take a watch or a listen, and hope you enjoy my interview with Edgar Wright. So I just kind of wanted to start off and ask you, as being a big music fan, I'm sure there were countless bands that you could have made a film about. What is it about your personal connection to Sparks or the story of Sparks that really drove you to make this film?
Well, I think it was something where it wasn't like I necessarily had kind of thought actively about doing a documentary or like picking like a band to do a documentary about. It sort of came about in a weird way because I had been a Sparks fan for a long time. And I think maybe my fandom had got like sort of, bigger in a way, just because I was kind of, I'd known them since I was 5 years old. They'd always been a bit of an enigmatic riddle to me in terms of they kept coming back into my life in like different guises, doing different genres. So, especially in a pre-internet age, I would be always like sort of impressed and amused, but kind of baffled by them. It's like, who is this band that keep changing their sound and still going after decades and decades? And then I think in like the last 20 years, especially since the release of Little Beethoven, I was just like endlessly impressed by the fact that unlike any other band that have been going as long as they have, they seem to be getting better, or certainly like they never were like dumbing down. They were always pushing for something kind of more or getting more ambitious. And it was just sort of highly unusual to me. So I guess in a way, I had a lot of questions just as a fan. And then I found myself like, when you're a Sparks fan, you start to become like an evangelist in the sense that you kind of like always trying to turn other people onto Sparks, especially when they mention a band who have been influenced by Sparks. And then it's like, oh, wow, if you like them, you'll love Sparks. So then I got it into my head, and this is probably around the time that I actually met Ron and Russell, where I would be saying to my friends, this band deserves to be bigger than they actually are, or more people need to know who they are. And like, maybe like, if there was only a documentary about them, like, then everybody could see how ahead of the curve they were and like how influential they'd been. And I started to sort of say that they were like the best and most influential band to not have a music documentary about them. Now, eventually, one of my friends called me out on this. Like, I went to see a Sparks gig in 2017 with Phil Lord, the director, and I was saying the same thing to him, as saying the only thing stopping this band from being as big as they can be is a documentary. Somebody needs to make a film about Sparks. And Phil said, you should do it. And I said, I will. And then after the gig, I pitched the idea to Ronald Russell. And as soon as I'd said it out loud, I realized that was a verbal contract, a promise that could not be broken. So like maybe like 3 years later, here we are with the finished film. I mean, in a weird way, it's that thing. It was more of a succinct way of me, rather than chewing people's ear off at dinner, trying to kind of convince them to listen to Sparks. Eventually, I thought it would be easier for me to make, a 2-hour plus film about them and say, here, watch this.
So sort of similar to that, in a lot of documentaries about bands or musicians that are either underrated or underexposed, it seems like it would be a challenge to, tell the story of the band, but also contextualize them to an uninformed audience, like about their legacy, and also give them an idea of what they sound like if they've never heard them before. So what's the challenge of doing that without the ability to like sit someone down and play them a bunch of albums?
Well, I feel like maybe, the film is just over 2 hours long. And part of that is because I wanted to give people, especially Sparks virgins, the opportunity to actually hear them. I felt like I watch a lot of music documentaries, and sometimes, not mentioning any names, I kind of get annoyed by some documentaries where they never give you the space to actually hear the song. And maybe you hear like 2 seconds of it, and then immediately the next talking head comes in. There was one in particular recently where I won't mention the name of it, but I thought, wow, if you didn't already know these songs, this documentary gives you no opportunity to appreciate it for like even like a second. So with Sparks, and with a 50-year career, and one that I felt like it was important to contextualize them, and they're a band where the misses are as fascinating as the hits, and somehow as important to the story as the hits. I just felt like you had to kind of like let people hear the music and see how it develops. So that was a really important thing to me. And I found in the edit that, I think there was a point actually where I'd been editing during lockdown, and I had a cut of the movie. And weirdly enough, I don't know why I keep talking about Phil Lord, but he was one of the many directors that I showed it to. And he did say, he said, I love the documentary. He goes, it'd be great if you could hear a bit more of the songs. And so I said to the editor, I said, we're going to do a pass where we just like let it breathe a little bit and just hear some of the songs. So, that's the finished thing, is that, and we're covering, like a huge discography, and that goes, the first Sparks album came out 50 years ago this year. So it's an extraordinary like body of work, but also it encompasses so much like time. And also just that the great thing about it for me was to show in the documentary who influenced them, or rather what influenced them, not just music, but like film and like TV and even advertising and just like pop culture. Then like the music that they make, then you see through the interviewees, the people that are inspired by Sparks, and what music they make. So it starts to kind of connect a lot of dots for people where they sort of understand, okay, that makes sense, because that band sounds a little bit like Sparks. And they, I got people on record to sort of say that they like were hugely influenced by them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that actually leads into another question I had, which is sort of about, music is obviously really important to your filmmaking, creating soundtracks and needle drops in the films themselves. When you have so much material to pull from Sparks, and also trying to give an idea of the context of the band, was it a different kind of challenge to pick the right songs for the moments in the film?
No, not really, because I think sort of they organically came through, or they're sort of telling the story themselves. So, like you might just it's a sort of an embarrassment of riches in a way, but I think ultimately to tell the story of each phase, we pick the kind of the key songs from each. like there might be like a few ones that kind of like don't kind of get their day in court, but for the most part, like through telling an album is that you have kind of like the sort of you can get the shape of the album from the tracks that we feature, and some that we go into. What's nice also is in places to go into great detail about an album track. It just like there's one point where Neil Gaiman does the deep dive on one of the songs from Indiscreet, which just because he's so passionate about it, like it might not be the most famous Spark song, but what you get from it is how like fervent the fans are and how eloquent they can be talking about a song that they heard in 1975 and has never left their brain.
Mm-hmm. In sort of on that same path, through either your own exploration or talking to people who you interviewed for this, did you walk away from this experience with a perspective on either a particular album or period of time for the band that was opened by hearing someone kind of talk about it, sort of like you talked about with him?
Yeah, I think actually, like in doing the documentary, I definitely got to know albums that I previously didn't know that well or only listened to a couple of times. Like I wasn't as au fait with the first album actually. Like sort of my kind of knowledge initially it started more with like Kimono My House, but I through doing the documentary, there's albums that now I really kind of like sort of grew to sort of love, like the first Half Nelson Stroke Sparks album, or Woofer in Tweeter's Clothing, or like ones that are like more, deep cuts in the kind of discography, like Introducing Sparks, which, I think Ron and Russell, when they saw the movie, they were dumbfounded to see Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers going into great detail, talking about probably their least successful album. So I thought like they found that stuff like fascinating. So I mean, definitely there's like songs that I sort of like were not among my favorite Spark songs that now are. Like, I think, like fun things like in the documentary, there's a great kind of like couple of anecdotes about the song Music That You Can Dance To, which now I know the story of the song and how it came to be, in which a record executive said, hey, yeah, this is great, but can you make some music that you can dance to? And then they did that, like, to the letter, almost as an FU to the executive. That makes me love the song even more.
Yeah. So there's a lot of people who would say that Sparks are a bit of a mystery, and I think it's Jason Schwartzman in the documentary who says that there's some level of mystique that he would like to even keep about the band. Did you share any of that hesitancy to peel back the curtain, or did you sense that from Ron and Russell at all? And what ultimately made for comfort with that decision?
I think that they, like maybe, I don't think they were hesitant at all because they were really excited about me doing the documentary. But I mean, I feel like to me, in a way, like if there was any like worry about what happens if you kind of explain the enigma, I think the fact that Ron and Russell themselves, I think, don't really know where Sparks end and they start, I think is almost like wrapped up in the enigma itself. Like, so, and in a way, like sometimes when you kind of reveal like the sort of the everyday lives of rock stars and even maybe the mundanity of it in some respects, to me, that makes the work even more impressive. It's like, it's almost like that Albert Einstein thing of him expending zero energy on what he's going to wear and what he's going to eat so he can put everything into his work. And I think Sparks are a bit like that as well, is that like the sort of, they lead these relatively normal lives, and then but on record it's the most avant-garde, operatic, cinematic sounding, spectacular, like the music that they make is their sort of like just their way of expressing themselves, in a more pronounced way than most rock stars, which I find personally quite fascinating. And then, not giving anything away, but at the end of the movie, in the end credits no less, we decide to kind of like, having dispelled some myths about Sparks, we decide to create a whole bunch of other BS, which then people can work out for the next 50 years whether that's true or not.
Yeah. in terms of like creating the film, was this a situation where you had access to a bunch of footage and sifted through it to find the best stuff, or was any of this given to you from Ron and Russell? How did the compiling of footage come about?
It was a bit of everything. We had an amazing archive producer, Kate Griffiths, and so obviously there's a ton of stuff out there from their different TV appearances and like live work and stuff. But Ron and Russell provided some things that had never been seen, like Russell's student film, his French New Wave spoof. But then also we got a lot of stuff from people out there, because myself and Sparks on social media put the sort of call out saying, you know, we're making this documentary. Do you have any footage or any photos or any stories? And we got a huge response from that. And some of that stuff is in the movie, like stuff that Ron and Russell had never seen, like sort of footage from some tour, like the 1976 Big Beat tour that fans took. Or, you know, that's how we found, there's a moment in the film where we have this concert footage where there's a lot of young female stage invaders, like disrupting the concert. And through putting the word out on social media, one of them got in contact with us to tell her story. And I said, hey, we have that gig. Let's interview her. She wrote this amazing email. And I said to the producer, George Henkin, I said, we should get her to tell that story on camera. Because that was one of the things with the documentary that was like this amazing gift, is like, unusually for a band that had been going since the early 70s, a lot of the participants are still with us. So like sort of nearly all of the personnel of the first album are in the documentary. All of the band, like the producer Todd Rundgren, the engineer Jim Lowe, their tour manager at the time, Larry DuPont, who also took all the photos. It's sort of really kind of odd and amazing to have access to all of those people still now. And then weird things like, hey, we can interview a fan that jumped on stage like at this 1975 concert, like, and who remembers it in vivid detail, and then cross-cut with the roadie who pulled her off like stage, who happens to now be the Rolling Stones tour manager. So it very quickly became like an oral history, and that was really down to sort of like the wide range of people who wanted to talk about it, from famous people to kind of people who were fans at the time and remain fans to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I have time for one more question. So I kind of wanted to get your sense of, you know, I feel like this movie is going to be an introduction to Sparks for a lot of people. And I've also, while I was getting into them, found your Sparks for Beginners Spotify playlist, which was also really helpful in getting to know them. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you want people to take away from the film in terms of the legacy of the band, sort of, you know, the idea that they continue to be who they were no matter what. What do you feel like is the big takeaway from that you hope people gain, and also, do you hope to see any sort of like spike in Spotify plays or any kind of bigger footprint for the band in this stage of their career?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm almost, even though I know Sparks fans are going to love it, I'm actually like even more excited for like people who are Sparks virgins to watch the movie, because I think from the reaction I've had already from people who don't know them, they like are sort of kind of agog that there's like a whole chapter in musical history that they missed, and featuring so many other people that they already like. So I think there's an element with the documentary where I think it will connect the dots for a lot of people. And then I think the takeaway from it is it really is like a story of like, you know, persistence of vision, that Sparks have sort of never wavered from this kind of their ambitions and their artistic vision and their kind of self-belief. And that sort of, I think, is a really inspiring thing, because a lot of people who, you know, follow their dream get easily dissuaded, or, you know, there's probably about 10 points in the documentary where I feel like other bands would have jacked it in. And the fact that Sparks just kept on going with this sort of like incredible, like sort of resilience against kind of sometimes total indifference, I think is ultimately just like an incredibly admirable and impressive feat. And there's a point where like, if you keep going for that long and doing what you want to do rather than listening to like sort of the kind of the trying to respond to the whims of a mainstream audience, there's a certain point where the audience just catches up with you. Like if you stay that far ahead of the curve, it sort of becomes like the tortoise and the hare. Do you know what I mean? It's like sort of like Sparks win the race, a 50-year overnight success.
Thank you for listening to the CineSnob podcast. To read reviews, interviews, and more, visit cinesnob.net. See you next week.